The child had no name anymore. In the holding pens of the Kratheen hunter ship Bloodclaw, names were the first things stripped away. The second was hope. The third, for most species, was the will to survive. She sat in the corner of the crystalline cage, knees drawn to her chest, watching the other captives with eyes that seemed too old for her small frame. 12 solar cycles, perhaps 13. It was hard to tell with humans. Their bodies age differently than most species in the galactic catalogues, slower in some ways, faster in others, and always unpredictable. The Kratheen had learned to hunt humans 300,000 years ago, when the remnants of Earth's children had scattered across the spiral arm after the collapse. Back then, humans had been refugees, beggars, weak things clinging to the edges of established civilizations, easy prey, delicious prey, according to some of the older hunting lodges. Their flesh held a particular quality, fear mixed with defiance, a flavor the Kratheen prized above all others. But that was ancient history. The humans were nearly extinct now, their numbers reduced to scattered colonies on forgotten worlds, their once vast empire nothing but archaeological curiosities and cautionary tales. The Kratheen ruled 17 systems. They had fleets that could shatter moons. They had never lost a hunt. The child knew all of this. She had been taught the histories, the probabilities, the statistics of survival. 0.03% for human captives aboard Kratheen vessels. The number sat in her mind like a stone, heavy and immovable. Around her, the other prisoners wept or screamed or sat in stunned silence. A Velosian merchant with 4 arms, all broken, 2 green miners, their exoskeletons cracked and leaking pale blue fluid. A family of shorter, small furry beings from the rim, huddled together, the parents covering their children's eyes. The child watched them all and said nothing. The ship's hull thrummed with the resonance of faster-than-light travel, a sound that vibrated through the bones and made thinking difficult. The Kratheen designed it that way. Fear worked better when rational thought was impossible. A door irised open at the far end of the holding bay, and 3 Kratheen hunters entered. They were magnificent in their cruelty. 8 feet tall scales the color of dried blood, triple-jointed legs that could spring them across a room in a single bound. Their heads were broad and flat, with eyes positioned for predatory vision, forward-facing, calculating, cold. Each wore hunting armor etched with kill marks, hundreds of tiny symbols representing successful hunts across dozens of worlds. The lead hunter, whose name scent translated roughly as renders the fleeing, approached the cages with deliberate slowness. Its claws clicked against the metal floor in a rhythm designed to trigger prey instincts in every species the Kratheen had catalogued. Click, click, click. The Velosian merchant began to hyperventilate. The green miners pressed themselves against the back of their cage. The shorter family's weeping intensified. The child remained still. Renders the fleeing stopped in front of her cage. Its nictitating membrane slid across its eyes in an expression that might have been curiosity or amusement. When it spoke, its voice was a series of clicks and hisses that the ship's translation matrix converted into standard galactic. A human child. How rare, how delicate. The child met its gaze without flinching. This seemed to surprise the hunter. Most prey species looked away, avoiding eye contact out of instinct. Humans usually screamed or cried or begged. This one simply stared back with dark eyes that reflected the harsh lights of the holding bay. "Do you know what happens to you now, little human?" Renders the fleeing asked, its mouth parts spreading in what the translation matrix labeled as a smile, though it held no warmth, no mercy. The child nodded once. A small, economical movement. "Then you know it is useless to resist, useless to run, useless to hope." The hunter's claws drummed against the cage bars, producing a sound like breaking bones. "Your species is weak, soft. We have hunted humans for 300 millennia, and not once has one escaped the Bloodclaw. Not once." "I know," the child said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the holding bay. Several of the other prisoners turned to look at her, perhaps surprised that she could speak at all. Renders the fleeing scales rippled in a pattern that indicated satisfaction. "Good. Fear with understanding is sweeter than mindless panic. You will make an excellent hunt, human child. Perhaps you will last longer than the others. Perhaps you will give us sport." The hunter turned to its companions, gesturing with its claws. "Prepare the hunting grounds. We release them at dawn cycle. Standard rules. No weapons, no technology. Survival by wit and speed alone." It looked back at the child. "Though for you, little human, we will make special accommodations. Your kind is so fragile after all. It would be disappointing if you died too quickly." The three hunters left, their laughter, a sound like grinding glass, echoing through the bay. As soon as the door sealed behind them, the Velosian merchant spoke, its voice trembling through all four of its vocal chambers simultaneously. "Child, I am sorry. So sorry. You should not have to face this. You are too young." "I'm 12, the child said, as if this explained something important. 12 what? Solar cycles? Rotations?" The merchant's broken arms twitched. "It doesn't matter. You're a baby. We are all going to die, but you haven't even lived." One of the green miners pressed against the bars separating their cages. Its compound eyes glittered with what might have been pity. "Is there no one who will miss you, human? No family, no clan?" "They're all dead," the child said simply. "The Kratheen killed them 3 cycles ago. Different ship, different hunt. I was hiding. They found me later." The Shorter family's patriarch, a being named Kelm, spoke through his tears. "Then you have already survived 1 hunt? That is remarkable." "I didn't survive," the child corrected. "I hid. There's a difference." "Is there?" Kelm asked. "You are alive. They are dead. Survival takes many forms." The child was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the floor of her cage. To the others, it might have looked like nervous fidgeting, the meaningless movements of a frightened child. But there was something deliberate about it, something purposeful that none of them could quite identify. "My mother taught me things," the child said finally. "Before. She said humans were different from other species. She said we remembered differently, thought differently, survived differently." The Velosian merchant made a sound that the translator labeled as sympathetic but resigned. "All parents tell their children that their species is special, little one. It is a kindness, a small light in the darkness. But here now in these cages, we are all the same. We are all just meat." "No," the child said, and there was something in her voice that made them all pay attention. "That's where you're wrong. We're not the same. Humans spent 3.2 million years being prey before we became predators, and then we spent another 2 million years pretending we weren't predators at all. We learned to hide it. We learned to seem weak. We learned to make other species underestimate us." She looked up, and her eyes held something that none of the other prisoners could quite name. It wasn't hope, exactly. It wasn't even determination. It was something older, something carved into the deepest parts of human DNA by millions of years of being hunted, being killed, being consumed, and somehow, impossibly, surviving anyway. "The Kratheen think they know how to hunt humans," she continued. "They've been doing it for 300,000 years, but humans have been learning how to be hunted for 3.2 million years. They have 300,000 years of experience. We have 3.2 million. They think they're the predators. They think we're the prey." The child stood up, her small hands gripping the bars of her cage. "They're about to learn that when you hunt something for long enough, eventually, it learns to hunt you back." The other prisoners stared at her, unsure whether to feel inspired or terrified by the certainty in her voice. Outside the holding bay, the blood claw continued its journey through the void, carrying them all toward the hunting grounds where only the Kratheen had ever emerged alive. The child sat back down and resumed tracing patterns on the floor of her cage. Circles within circles, lines intersecting at precise angles, shapes that meant nothing to the other species watching her, but would have been instantly recognizable to any human who had studied the old texts. They were trap schematics. She was counting the steps between the door and each cage. She was measuring the rhythm of the guards' patrols. She was doing what humans had always done best. She was learning the terrain, identifying the weaknesses, and planning the hunt. Because that was the thing about being prey for 3.2 million years. Eventually you became very, very good at it, and then, when the moment was right, you became something else entirely. The child closed her eyes and began the mental exercises her mother had taught her, the ones that had been passed down through generations of human survivors, refined and perfected over millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Her heartbeat slowed. Her breathing became shallow and controlled. Her mind began to construct a 3-dimensional map of the entire ship, using nothing but sound, smell, vibration, and the unconscious processing power of a brain that had evolved to track predators through the tall grass of ancient Earth. The Kratheen had 300,000 years of hunting experience, but the child had 3.2 million years of being hunted, and in the mathematics of survival, that was the only number that mattered. Dawn cycle was coming. The hunt would begin, and this time, The predators were about to discover what it meant to be prey. The hunting grounds were beautiful, in the way that only death could be beautiful. The Kratheen had constructed the arena on a moon they had hollowed out centuries ago, carving its interior into a maze of ecosystems stolen from 100 different worlds. Forests from Velo's prime, where the trees grew upside down and their roots drank starlight. Crystalline deserts from green, where the sand sang in frequencies that could shatter bone. Swamps from the shorter homeworld, thick with bioluminescent fog and predators that hunted by thermal signature. And in the center of it all, a recreation of ancient Earth's savanna, complete with tall grass, scattered trees, and a watering hole that reflected the artificial sun the Kratheen had installed in the moon's core. The child stood at the edge of the savanna section, her bare feet sinking slightly into soil that had been imported at great expense from a dead world 3,000 light-years away. The Kratheen spared no expense for their hunts. Authenticity mattered. Terror required the proper setting. Around her, the other prisoners had been released at strategic intervals. The Kratheen hunting doctrine was precise. Space the prey far enough apart that they couldn't coordinate, but close enough that their panic would spread like a contagion through the arena. Fear was a weapon, and the Kratheen had mastered its deployment. The child could hear screaming in the distance. The Velosian merchant, probably, or perhaps the green miners. The Shorter family had been released together. A mercy of sorts, though it would only prolong their suffering. The Kratheen enjoyed hunting families. The desperation of parents trying to protect their children produced exceptional sport. Above, embedded in the curved ceiling of the hollow moon, observation platforms held the Kratheen elite. This was more than a hunt. It was entertainment, social currency, a demonstration of power. The wealthiest Kratheen families paid fortunes for the privilege of watching prey run and die in increasingly creative ways. The child ignored the platforms. She had already calculated their positions during the transport from the holding bay, had already estimated the angles of their viewing fields and identified the blind spots. Information was ammunition, and humans had learned to hoard every scrap. A horn sounded, low and resonant, vibrating through the artificial atmosphere. The hunt had officially begun. The Kratheen would wait exactly 30 standard minutes before releasing the hunters. It was tradition. It gave the prey time to run, to hide, to make futile plans. It made the eventual capture that much sweeter. The child didn't run. Instead, she walked slowly through the savanna grass, her hands trailing through the golden stalks, her eyes scanning the terrain with the systematic efficiency of a species that had once survived by reading landscapes for threats and opportunities. She noted the wind direction, the position of the artificial sun, the distribution of trees, the contours of the land. This was Earth's savanna, or a reasonable approximation of it. The Kratheen had chosen well. This was where humanity had been born, where her ancestors had spent millions of years learning to outwit predators that were faster, stronger, and more naturally armed. This was the classroom where humans had learned every lesson that mattered. The Kratheen thought they were giving her a familiar environment, to make her feel comfortable before they killed her. They had actually given her the home field advantage. She found what she was looking for near a cluster of acacia trees. A termite mound, tall and solid, baked hard by the artificial sun. She circled it slowly, examining its structure, then nodded to herself and moved on. 50 meters away, she found a cluster of stones, their surfaces rough and angular. She selected 3, testing their weight and balance, then tucked them into the waistband of her prison garment. A stream cut through the savanna, shallow and clear. She followed it downstream until she found a place where the banks were soft mud. She knelt there for several minutes, her hands working quickly, gathering materials, testing consistencies, building something that wouldn't be visible to aerial observation, but would be impossible to miss for anyone moving through the terrain at ground level. The horn sounded again. 15 minutes had passed, halfway through the grace period. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a scream cut short. One of the prisoners had encountered something they couldn't outrun. The Kratheen had populated the arena with hunting beasts, creatures engineered or imported to serve as opening acts before the main event. The child finished her work at the stream and moved on, heading toward the border where the savanna met the crystal desert. The transition was abrupt, artificial, the kind of boundary that didn't exist in nature. She studied it carefully, running her fingers along the line where grass met sand, feeling the texture change. Then she began to dig. Her hands moved quickly despite their small size, scooping sand, arranging it in specific patterns, creating contours that looked natural but were anything but. She worked with the focused intensity of someone following instructions that had been coded into her DNA by millions of years of trial and error. Every human child learned the basics, the fundamentals of survival that had been refined across countless generations. But her mother had been special. Her mother had been a keeper, one of the last humans who maintained the old knowledge, the deep knowledge, the lessons that went back to the very beginning. She had taught the child things that most modern humans had forgotten, skills that seemed primitive and useless in an age of starships and energy weapons. She had taught her how to read a landscape, how to create barriers that weren't barriers, how to build traps from nothing but dirt, stone, and understanding. The third horn sounded, 5 minutes remaining. The child looked up at the artificial sun, calculating its arc, estimating the time until shadow patterns would shift. Then she ran, not frantically but with purpose, heading toward a section of forest she had identified from the transport vehicle. The trees here were tall and old, their bark rough and deeply grooved. She found one that satisfied her requirements and began to climb. Not high, that would make her visible from the observation platforms, just high enough to change her silhouette, to break up the human shape that predators instinctively recognized. She wedged herself into a fork where 3 branches met and went completely still. This was the hardest part. Running was easy, fighting was straightforward, but stillness, true stillness, required something that most species had never developed. Humans had. Humans had learned to be so still that they became part of the landscape, invisible not through technology, but through absolute control of every muscle, every breath, every unconscious movement that might betray position. Her heart rate slowed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, mimicking the random patterns of wind through leaves. Her eyes unfocused slightly, using peripheral vision instead of direct gaze, because predators could feel when they were being watched. The final horn sounded. The hunt had begun. She heard them before she saw them. The Kratheen moved through terrain with a distinctive rhythm, their triple-jointed legs producing a syncopated pattern that was unmistakable once you knew to listen for it. 3 of them, moving in a standard sweep formation, covering ground quickly, but not recklessly. They entered the savanna section 200 meters from her position, their scales gleaming in the artificial sunlight, their hunting armor reading thermal signatures and movement patterns. One of them was Renders the Fleeing, the lead hunter from the ship. The others were unknown to her, but their posture and bearing suggested experience and skill. They paused at the edge of the grass, their heads swiveling in coordinated arcs, scanning for prey. One of them raised a device to its face, studying the readout. Multiple thermal signatures, it said, its voice carrying clearly across the open ground. The Velocian is moving east, toward the Crystal Desert. The green are stationary, dead or dying. The shorter family is in the swamp section. Standard fear response, attempting to hide in the vegetation. Renders the Fleeing clicked its mandibles in satisfaction. And the human child? The one with the device adjusted its settings, frowning. Signal is unclear. Thermal bloom is scattered across multiple locations in the savanna and forest sections. Either the device is malfunctioning or the human is doing something clever. Renders the Fleeing finished. Its eyes narrowed. Interesting. Perhaps this one will provide sport after all. Spread out. Standard search pattern. Remember, the child is the priority. The others are appetizers. This one is the main course. The 3 hunters separated, each taking a different vector through the terrain. One headed directly into the savanna grass. Another angled toward the stream. The third, Renders the Fleeing, moved toward the forest section where the child waited. She watched it approach, tracking its movement through peripheral vision, her body so still that even the tree's natural swaying didn't disturb her position. The hunter moved well, she had to admit. It understood terrain, used cover effectively, checked its angles before committing to movement. 300,000 years of hunting humans had taught the Kratheen many things. But 3.2 million years of being hunted had taught humans more. Renders the Fleeing passed within 20 meters of her tree. Its thermal scanner swept past her position twice, registering nothing unusual. She had chosen her spot well. The fork where the branches met created a natural thermal confusion. The wood's residual heat blending with her own body temperature in a way that read as background noise to the scanner. The hunter moved on, heading deeper into the forest, and the child allowed herself a single slow breath. The first test had been passed. She had confirmed that their scanning technology had predictable limitations. She had verified their search patterns. She had measured the distance between hunters and calculated the time it would take for them to respond to a call for assistance. All useful data, all ammunition. In the distance, she heard another scream, this one ending in a wet, gurgling sound. Another prisoner dead. The Kratheen would be keeping score, tallying kills, awarding points based on style and difficulty. The child was worth more than the others. Human prey always was, but only if they could catch her. She waited until the hunters were out of immediate range, then descended from the tree with slow, careful movements. Every motion was deliberate, designed to minimize sound and vibration. She had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from a line of humans stretching back to when her ancestors had lived in trees like this one, and survival meant not attracting the attention of things with larger teeth. On the ground again, she moved back toward the savannah, staying low, using the grass for cover. She could still hear the hunters moving through different sections of the arena, their confidence evident in the sounds they made. They weren't trying to be quiet. They didn't need to be. They were the apex predators here they had never lost. The child reached the termite mound she had identified earlier and knelt beside it. From her waistband, she pulled one of the stones she had collected and began to work, chipping away at its edge with precise, controlled strikes against the mound's hard surface. The sound was slight, easily lost in the ambient noise of the arena, but she worked quickly anyway. Time was finite. The hunters would complete their first sweep soon and begin a more systematic search. After several minutes, she had what she needed, a stone with a sharp edge, not quite a knife, but close enough, primitive, laughable by galactic standards. But humans had conquered a planet and built a civilization with tools exactly like this, had turned themselves from prey into the most successful predators Earth had ever known. She wrapped the stone's base in grass to protect her hand and tucked it away. Then she moved to the next location, the stream where she had prepared her surprise earlier. She checked her work, made small adjustments, then nodded in satisfaction and moved on. The child spent the next hour creating what her mother had called a terrain web, a series of interconnected traps, false trails, and prepared positions that turned the environment itself into a weapon. Each element was subtle, almost invisible, the kind of thing that only made sense when you understood how predators moved, how they thought, how they pursued. The Kratheen were excellent hunters. They had perfected their craft over 300,000 years, but they had been hunting species that fought back with technology, with weapons, with strength. They had never hunted a species that fought back with thinking, with planning, with millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had turned weakness into strategy and vulnerability into advantage. They had never hunted something that had spent longer as prey than they had existed as a species. From the observation platforms above, the Kratheen elite watched with growing puzzlement. The human child was moving through the arena, but not in patterns that made sense. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was doing something, working at something. But what? On the arena floor, Renders the Fleeing stood in the center of the savannah, its frustration evident in the aggressive posture of its scales. 2 hours had passed. The other prisoners were dead, their bodies already being processed for the feast that would follow the hunt. But the child remained elusive, her thermal signature flickering in and out of detection, her movements impossible to predict. "She's playing with us," one of the other hunters said, its voice tight with anger. "No," Renders the Fleeing said slowly. "She's doing something else, something we don't understand yet. She's a human child, barely more than a baby. What could she possibly—" The hunter's words cut off as it stepped forward, and its leg plunged through what had appeared to be solid ground. The pit wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet, but it was enough. The hunter's triple-jointed leg bent at an unnatural angle, and the creature roared in pain and surprise. Renders the Fleeing rushed to its companion's side, scanning the area with new wariness. The pit had been cunningly disguised, covered with a layer of woven grass and dirt that had looked exactly like the surrounding terrain. Primitive, simple, effective, impossible, Renders the Fleeing breathed. She had no tools, no materials. How could she— The hunter's words died as understanding began to dawn. The child had been preparing the arena, turning it into something that served her purposes rather than theirs. She had been learning the terrain, identifying the choke points, creating zones of control. She had been doing what humans had always done, adapting the environment to make up for physical weakness. High above, on the observation platforms, The Kratheen elite leaned forward with sudden interest. This was unexpected. This was different. This was entertaining. Below, in the shadows at the edge of the forest, the child watched the injured hunter being helped by its companion. She had expected that trap to work, had calculated the probability at 73% based on the Kratheen gait pattern and visual processing. The real traps were still waiting, and the hunters were beginning to understand that they might not be hunting anymore. They might be being herded. The child allowed herself a small smile, her first since capture, and melted back into the terrain that had birthed her species and taught it every lesson it needed to survive. The hunt was changing, and the Kratheen were about to learn why humans had never truly gone extinct, no matter how many times the galaxy had tried to erase them, because humanity's greatest weapon had never been strength or technology. It had always been the ability to turn being hunted into an advantage. And after 3.2 million years of practice, they had become very, very good at it. The observation platform designated Alpha 7 held the finest view of the arena's savannah section, and it was here that Lord Keshatar, patriarch of the Keshtar hunting clan, watched the proceedings with growing fascination. He was ancient by Kratheen standards. His scales faded to the color of old bronze, his hunting days long behind him. But his mind remained sharp, and he had seen more hunts than any living Kratheen, thousands of them, tens of thousands perhaps. He had witnessed every permutation of terror, every variety of prey response, every possible outcome. This was different. "Replay the last hour," he commanded, and the holographic display before him rewound, showing the child's movements in accelerated time. She appeared and disappeared, working at the edges of visibility, never quite exposing herself fully to the hunter's scanners. Her pattern looked random at first, but when viewed from above, from this God's eye perspective, something else emerged. A design, a purpose, a plan. "She's mapping the entire arena," Keshatar said aloud, though he was speaking more to himself than to his attendants. Not just moving through it, mapping it, learning it, claiming it. One of his aides, a younger Kratheen named Shekril, hissed dismissively, "She's a human child, my lord, barely capable of coherent thought. What you perceive as strategy is likely nothing more than panic response, creating the illusion of pattern." Keshatar's eyes never left the display. "Have you studied human history, Shekril? I know they were once numerous. Now they are nearly extinct. That tells me everything I need to know about their effectiveness as a species." "That tells you nothing at all," Keshatar said quietly. "Humans held 17 systems at their peak, from only a single origin world. Do you know how rare that is? Most species that achieve multi-system colonization originate from worlds with multiple sentient species, or from environments so harsh that space travel becomes necessary for survival. But humans came from a garden world. Abundant resources, moderate climate. They had no evolutionary pressure to reach the stars." "Then why did they?" Shekril asked, despite himself interested. "Because they were bored," Keshatar said, and his mandibles spread in what might have been amusement, or curious, or ambitious. The historical texts are unclear, but they reached the stars anyway, despite having no survival imperative to do so. That alone should have warned us that they were unusual. On the display, the child was doing something at the stream's edge, her small hands working quickly in the mud. To the untrained eye, it looked like meaningless activity, the fidgeting of a frightened child, but Keshatar had lived long enough to recognize purpose when he saw it. "They are also the only species in the galactic record," he continued, "to have evolved from prey ancestry. Every other spacefaring race came from predator stock or scavenger lines. Humans are unique. They were prey for millions of years before they became predators. And then, remarkably, they became the most successful predators their planet had ever known. If they are so successful, why are they nearly extinct now?" Shekril challenged. "Because they are terrible at large-scale cooperation," Keshatar admitted. "They fight themselves almost as enthusiastically as they fight others. Internal conflicts destroyed most of their colonies. We Kratheen merely finished what they started." He paused. "Or so we thought." On the arena floor, Renders the Fleeing was coordinating with the other hunters, their movements becoming more cautious, more systematic. They had learned, after the first trap, that assumptions were dangerous. They were adapting their strategy, becoming more careful. But the child was adapting faster. She appeared at the edge of the crystal desert, visible for just a moment before vanishing behind a dune. The hunters converged on the location, moving with renewed confidence. They had her pattern now. They understood her tactics. She was using terrain features to break up her thermal signature, relying on primitive concealment rather than technology. They could counter that. They had protocols for low-tech prey. The first hunter reached the dune where the child had vanished and crested it carefully, scanner sweeping for threats. Nothing, just sand and scattered rocks. He signaled the others forward. The sand beneath them shifted. It happened slowly at first, just a gentle sliding sensation, easy to dismiss. But the slide accelerated, the dune's face collapsing in a carefully engineered avalanche that sent all three hunters tumbling down its slope into a depression that hadn't been visible from above. They landed hard but not harmfully. The Kratheen were built for punishment, their armored hides and flexible joints absorbing impacts that would have killed most species. They rose quickly, embarrassed more than injured, and looked around the depression they had fallen into. It was roughly circular, maybe 20 meters in diameter, with steep sides. Not impassable, but it would take time to climb out. Time during which they would be vulnerable, exposed, their attention divided between escape and tracking their prey. Clever, Renders the fleeing admitted, studying the depression's structure. She excavated this beforehand and used the removed sand to create an unstable dune face above it. When we triggered the weight threshold, the whole thing collapsed. Primitive engineering, but effective. "Do you think she's nearby?" one of the others asked, scanning the surrounding terrain. "Probably not," Renders the fleeing said. "This was designed to slow us down, not trap us. She's creating distance, buying time. But for what? What is her endgame? She can't escape the arena. She can't kill us. She has no weapons. What is she trying to accomplish?" The question hung in the air as they began climbing out of the depression. It took longer than they would have liked, the sandy sides offering poor purchase even for their powerful legs. When they finally emerged, they were no longer confident. They were wary. The child had gotten into their heads. On platform Alpha 7, Lord Keshatar was watching the same question play out in his own mind. What was the child's objective? Survival. Unlikely. The arena was sealed, and even if she somehow killed all the hunters, she would simply face more. Revenge? Impossible. She lacked the means to inflict meaningful harm. So what then? He watched her appear again, this time near the forest edge, visible just long enough for the hunters to mark her position before disappearing into the trees, leading them, drawing them forward. Toward what? Keshatar enhanced the display, zooming in on the section of forest where the child had vanished. His ancient eyes scanned the terrain, reading it the way his ancestors had read hunting grounds centuries ago, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to see it. The child wasn't just moving randomly through the arena. She was creating a circuit, a path that looped back on itself, that took the hunters through specific terrain features in a specific order. Each trap, each delay, each moment of confusion wasn't random. They were components in a larger design. She was building something, an equation with variables that only she understood, and the hunters were the unwitting tools of its construction. "Bring me the arena schematics," Keshatar ordered. "Original construction documents. I want to see what's beneath the surface." His aide hurried to comply, pulling up the relevant data. The moon's hollow interior was a marvel of engineering. Environmental systems, structural supports, power conduits, all the infrastructure necessary to maintain an artificial ecosystem. The display showed it all in cross-section, color-coded by function and importance. Keshatar studied it for a long moment, comparing the schematic to the child's movement pattern. Then his eyes widened slightly, the Kratheen equivalent of shock. "She's not trying to escape," he said quietly. "She's not trying to survive, she's doing mathematics." "My lord?" Shekril asked, confused. "Look at her pattern of movement. Look at where she's led them. Every location corresponds to a structural support column or an environmental processor. She's been studying the arena's infrastructure, identifying its critical systems. And now she's leading the hunters through a sequence that will bring them into proximity with those systems in a specific order. To what purpose? She has no way to damage them, doesn't she?" Keshatar zoomed in on one of the locations the child had visited earlier, the termite mound in the savannah. What did she do here? The cameras show her working with stones, creating tools. What kind of tools? The answer hit them both at the same moment. Sharp tools, cutting tools, tools that could sever power conduits if someone small enough could access the maintenance shafts that ran through the arena's structure. "She's going to collapse the arena," Shekril breathed. "No," Keshatar corrected. "She's going to change it. alter the environmental systems, create conditions that favor her instead of the hunters. He pulled up the child's current position and overlaid it with the infrastructure map. Right now, she's heading toward Environmental Processor 7. That controls atmosphere composition for the forest section. If she could access it, if she could alter its settings, the hunters would be at a disadvantage. Shekril finished. Their respiratory systems are optimized for high oxygen content, but humans evolved in variable atmosphere conditions. They can function in ranges that would incapacitate us. On the arena floor, Renders the Fleeing had finally caught up to the child's trail. She was in the forest section, moving through undergrowth, leaving signs that seemed careless, almost deliberately easy to follow. Too easy. The hunter slowed, signaling his companions to spread out. This felt like another trap, another delay. But they had adapted. They knew her tactics now. They would proceed with caution, verify every step, take no chances. They moved forward in careful synchronization, checking angles, scanning for threats. The undergrowth was thick here, limiting visibility, creating ambush opportunities. Perfect terrain for prey to make a stand. They found her near a massive tree. Its trunk, wider than a Kratheen, was tall. She was pressed against its far side, barely visible, her small form almost lost in the shadows and roots. Trapped, cornered, finally. Renders the Fleeing approached slowly, savoring the moment. 3 hours of pursuit, 3 hours of frustration and embarrassment, and now, finally, the satisfaction of capture. He would make this quick. She had earned that much through her ingenuity, but he would make sure she understood, in her final moments, that clever tricks were no match for true predatory superiority. "Well played, little human," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "You gave us sport. You showed intelligence, but the hunt always ends the same way. The predator wins, the prey dies. It has been this way for 300,000 years. The child looked up at him, and for the first time since capture, she smiled. It was a small smile, sad and knowing, and it made Renders the Fleeing pause. 300,000 years, she repeated. That's how long you've been hunting us. Do you know how long we've been preparing to be hunted? It doesn't matter, Renders the Fleeing began. 3.2 million years, the child interrupted. We've been prey 10 times longer than you've been predators. We've forgotten more about being hunted than you'll ever learn about hunting. And do you know what you learn after 3.2 million years of being something's dinner? She pushed away from the tree, and Renders the Fleeing noticed, too late, that her hands were covered in sap, thick resinous sap from the tree's trunk, and wrapped around that sap were dozens of small, sharp fragments of stone, creating a surface that was rough, abrasive, capable of gripping. The child's hand shot out, faster than any child should have been able to move, and grabbed a hanging vine that Renders the Fleeing hadn't noticed. She pulled, and the vine came free, and suddenly the massive tree was shifting, its roots torn loose from ground that had been carefully excavated around its base, its tremendous weight beginning to fall, not toward the child, toward the hunters. They scattered, their superior speed and reflexes saving them from being crushed. The tree crashed down with a sound like thunder, and in the chaos and confusion of its falling, none of them noticed the small access panel that had been revealed in the ground where the tree's roots had been. A maintenance shaft, barely large enough for a human child. By the time the hunters recovered and looked for her, the child was gone. Deep beneath the arena floor, crawling through spaces that had never been designed for intrusion, the child moved with purpose toward Environmental Processor 7. In her hand was her stone blade, wrapped carefully to protect her grip. In her mind was a map of the moon's infrastructure, memorized from careful observation and deduction during her hours in the arena. She reached the processor after 20 minutes of crawling through darkness, guided by sound and vibration, and the unconscious spatial reasoning that humans had developed over millions of years of navigating complex environments. The processor was a massive cylinder of metal and ceramic, its surface warm to the touch, humming with power. She found the access panel her observations had suggested would be here and pried it open with her stone blade. Inside was a maze of conduits and control interfaces, all labeled in Kratheen script that she couldn't read. But she didn't need to read. She just needed to understand cause and effect, input and output, the basic logic of engineered systems that worked the same way across all species. She began cutting specific conduits, carefully chosen, testing the results, adjusting her approach based on feedback. It was slow, methodical work, the kind of problem-solving that humans excelled at, that had carried them from stone tools to starships. Above, in the arena, the hunters gathered near the fallen tree, trying to understand where their prey had gone. and slowly they began to notice changes. The air was different, thinner. The temperature was dropping. The artificial sun was dimming. On platform Alpha 7, Lord Keshatar watched it all unfold with something that might have been pride, if he could feel that emotion for another species. "She's rewriting the arena," he said softly, "changing the rules, making it her territory instead of ours." "Should we stop her?" Shekriel asked. Keshatar considered. "No. I want to see how this ends. I want to see what 3.2 million years of evolutionary pressure has created." He leaned forward, his ancient eyes bright with interest. "I want to see what happens when the prey decides to become the predator." Below, in the darkness of the maintenance tunnels, the child finished her work and began crawling toward her next objective. She had 7 more processors to modify, 7 more variables in her equation, and when she was done, the hunters would learn what humans had always known, that being weak wasn't the same as being helpless. That being prey didn't mean you couldn't fight back, that sometimes if you were clever enough, patient enough, and willing to use every advantage that millions of years of evolution had given you, the hunted could become the hunter. The equation was almost complete, and the solution was going to surprise everyone. Renders the fleeing felt the change in his lungs first. Each breath required more effort, pulling in air that felt thin and unsatisfying. His secondary respiratory chambers, vestigial organs that most Kratheen barely used, began to activate automatically, trying to compensate for the reduced oxygen levels. It was uncomfortable, but not yet dangerous. The Kratheen could tolerate atmospheric variations. They were hunters, after all, and hunts took them to many different worlds. But this was different. This wasn't a natural environment. This was their arena, their controlled space, and it was being altered without their permission, by a human child, by prey. The humiliation of that realization burned worse than the oxygen deprivation. "She's in the infrastructure," Renders the fleeing said, his voice steady despite his growing concern. "She's accessing the environmental systems. We need to alert the overseers, have them initiate lockdown protocols." One of the other hunters, a younger female named Shekmar, was already attempting to activate her communication device. After several tries, she hissed in frustration. "Communications are disrupted. Something is interfering with the signal." "The child couldn't possibly," the third hunter began, then stopped, because they all knew now that assumptions about what the child could or couldn't do were dangerous. She had already exceeded every expectation, violated every rule about how prey was supposed to behave. The artificial sun above them flickered, dimmed further, then stabilized at perhaps half its original intensity. The savanna grass, which had been golden in the bright light, now appeared grey and shadowed. The temperature continued to drop, and Renders the fleeing could see his breath condensing in the cooling air. "She's creating an environment that favors her physiology over ours," he said, and despite everything he felt a grudging respect for the strategy. Humans evolved in variable climates. Their homeworld experienced dramatic temperature fluctuations, seasonal changes, atmospheric variations. They're adapted for instability, we're not. "So we adapt," Shekmar said, adjusting her hunting armor's thermal regulators. "We're not helpless. We have technology. We have weapons. We have 300,000 years of hunting experience." "And she has 3.2 million years of being hunted," Renders the fleeing quoted back, remembering the child's words. At the time, he had dismissed them as bravado. Now, he was beginning to understand they might have been a warning. Above them, on the observation platforms, the mood was shifting from casual entertainment to genuine interest. The Kratheen elite, who had paid fortunes to watch a simple hunt, were now witnessing something unprecedented. Prey that fought back, prey that altered its environment, prey that demonstrated strategic thinking beyond anything in the hunting lodge records. Lord Keshatar had ceased making observations aloud. He was too focused on the data streaming across his displays, tracking the child's movements through the maintenance tunnels, monitoring the systematic changes she was making to each environmental processor she accessed. There was a pattern to her modifications, a logic that suggested deep understanding of systems engineering, or more likely, an intuitive grasp of cause and effect refined by millions of years of evolutionary problem-solving. She was 3 hours into her sabotage and had accessed 5 of the 7 critical processors. Oxygen levels in the arena were down to 18%, still breathable for Kratheen, but increasingly uncomfortable. Temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The artificial sun was cycling through irregular patterns, creating disorienting light fluctuations. and the atmospheric humidity was rising rapidly, creating fog banks that limited visibility and played havoc with thermal scanners. "She's not just making random changes," Keshatar observed to his aide. "She's creating specific conditions that mirror Earth's climate during certain periods of its history. I believe she's recreating a Paleolithic environment, the era when her ancestors first began to dominate their planet's ecosystem, despite being physically inferior to most predators. Surely the hunters can still overcome a child, regardless of atmospheric conditions," Shekril said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Perhaps," Keshatar said, "but consider what she's actually done. She has transformed a carefully controlled environment designed to favor the hunters into a chaotic one that negates many of their advantages. Thermal scanners become unreliable in fog and variable temperatures. Communication systems struggle with atmospheric interference. The hunter's superior speed and strength matter less when visibility is limited and terrain becomes treacherous. She hasn't made herself stronger, she's made them weaker. That's a very human solution to the problem of being prey." In the arena, Renders the Fleeing had made a decision. "We need to split up. One of us finds the access points she's using and blocks them, preventing further sabotage. The other two hunt her down while she's still in the infrastructure. She's trapped in those tunnels. There are only so many exits, we can contain her. I'll seal the access points," Shekmar volunteered. "I'm the fastest climber. I can reach them quickly." "Take this," Renders the Fleeing said, handing her a portable sealing unit from his equipment harness. "Weld them shut. Make sure she can't use them again." Shekmar nodded and sprinted toward the nearest maintenance access, her powerful legs carrying her across the savannah in great bounds. The third hunter, whose name was Kreshtal, moved to flank Renders the Fleeing as they began searching for additional access points, following the logic of the infrastructure layout. They found the first entrance near the stream where the child had worked earlier. It was open, the cover carefully removed and set aside. Renders the Fleeing peered down into darkness that his eyes couldn't penetrate. His thermal scanner showed residual heat signatures, but nothing recent. "She was here," he said, "perhaps an hour ago. She's moving through the system, hitting multiple locations." He pulled out a mapping device and overlaid the arena layout with infrastructure schematics. "There are 7 critical environmental processors. She's already accessed 5. If she completes her circuit and modifies the remaining 2, the environmental conditions will become untenable for extended operations. We'll need to evacuate the arena for recalibration." "A human child cannot force the Kratheen to abandon their own hunting ground," Kreshetal said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She already has," Renders the Fleeing replied quietly. "We're simply too proud to admit it yet." A sound echoed from the tunnel, metal on metal, the distinctive ring of a blade striking a conduit. The child was still working, still modifying, still executing whatever plan she had constructed. And they were up here in increasingly hostile conditions, while she moved freely through a maintenance network that had never been designed to prevent intrusion because no prey had ever been clever enough to find it. Renders the Fleeing made a choice that would have been unthinkable 4 hours ago. "Seal this entrance. I'm going in after her." "My lord, the tunnels are narrow, designed for maintenance drones and small repair crews. You won't be able to maneuver effectively, which is why I'm going alone. She'll hear you following. She'll know we're coming and will adapt. But one hunter, moving carefully, might be able to close the distance before she realizes the threat." He began removing his hunting armor, stripping down to the basic armored hide beneath. "Seal the entrance behind me. If she tries to exit here, she'll be trapped." "And if you're the one who becomes trapped?" Kreshtal asked. "Then you'll have learned something valuable about underestimating prey," Renders the Fleeing said, and dropped into the darkness. The maintenance tunnels were worse than he had imagined. Narrow, dark, the air thick with lubricants and ozone and the heat of machinery. His powerful body, built for sprinting across open ground and overpowering prey with brute force, was grotesquely unsuited for this environment. He had to crawl, his scales scraping against metal walls, his breathing labored in the confined space. This was the child's world now. She had chosen a battlefield that negated every advantage he possessed and maximized her own strengths. Small size became an asset. Flexibility mattered more than strength. Familiarity with confined spaces, spaces like the ones her ancestors had sheltered in for millions of years, trumped raw physical power. He crawled forward, following the sound of her work. She was close, perhaps only 50 meters ahead. The tunnel branched and he paused, trying to determine which path she had taken. His thermal scanner was useless here. Everything was hot, the ambient temperature of the machinery overwhelming any biological signatures. But he had other senses. He stilled himself and listened, filtering out the hum of processors and the rush of ventilation, focusing on smaller sounds. There, to the left, a scraping noise, metal on stone. The child's improvised blade working on another conduit. He moved left, his confidence growing. She didn't know he was here. She thought she was safe in her maze of tunnels, but he was close now, very close. And when he caught her, when he finally ended this humiliating chase, he would make sure the watching elite understood that the Kratheen was still supreme, that one clever child with primitive tools was no match for a hunter with 3 centuries of experience. The tunnel opened into a small maintenance chamber, barely large enough for him to raise his head, and there, in the dim light of her work, was the child, her back to him, vulnerable, focused on the conduit she was severing with her stone blade. Renders the fleeing felt a moment of pure triumph. He had won. The hunt was over. He tensed his muscles, preparing to spring forward and end this with one decisive strike. The child spoke without turning around. "You're breathing too loud," she said. "I heard you 3 minutes ago." Renders the fleeing froze. "Then why didn't you run?" "Because I wanted you here," the child said, and finally turned to face him. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "This is the 6th processor. 1 more to go, but I couldn't be sure you'd let me reach it, so I had to make you follow me somewhere I could delay you." "Delay me?" Renders the fleeing laughed, though it came out strained in the confined space. "Child, I am between you and the exit. You are trapped. Your clever tricks end here." "I'm not trapped in here with you," the child said, and her hand moved to a panel on the wall beside her. "You're trapped in here with me. There's a difference." She pulled the panel, and Renders the fleeing had just enough time to understand what she had done before the maintenance chamber's emergency purge system activated. Designed to flush out toxic fumes or extinguish fires, the system could evacuate the chamber's atmosphere in seconds, creating a temporary vacuum before refilling with fresh air. For a human child who had grown up hearing stories of Earth's ancient warriors holding their breath for minutes at a time while diving for food, 90 seconds of vacuum was survivable. Painful, certainly. Dangerous, absolutely. But survivable. For a Kratheen, whose respiratory system required continuous oxygen flow and whose body couldn't tolerate rapid pressure changes, 90 seconds of vacuum was catastrophic. Renders the fleeing felt the air rush out of the chamber, felt his lungs collapsing, felt his consciousness dimming. His last clear thought before darkness claimed him was profound respect for the child who had just proven that 3.2 million years of being prey had taught humanity lessons that 300,000 years of being predators couldn't match. The child watched the hunter collapse, waited until the chamber repressurized, then checked his vital signs. Alive, unconscious. No permanent damage if he received medical attention soon. She hadn't wanted to kill him. Killing wasn't the point. Proving that humans could fight back, that they could adapt, that they could turn any environment into an advantage, that was the point. She stepped over his unconscious form and continued toward the 7th processor. 1 more to go, 1 more variable in her equation, and then she would see if her theory was correct, if her calculations were sound, if 3.2 million years of evolution had really prepared her for this moment. On the observation platforms, Lord Keshatar watched the hunter collapse and felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. The Kratheen had ruled for centuries on the assumption that they were apex predators, that might made right, that the strong would always dominate the weak. But the child had just demonstrated that strength was context-dependent, that the weak could make themselves strong by changing the context. That evolution had given humanity tools the Kratheen had never needed to develop: adaptability, creativity, the ability to turn any environment into home ground. "She's going to complete her circuit," Keshatar said, "and when she does, the arena will be utterly transformed. It will no longer be our territory. It will be hers." "Should we intervene?" Shekriel asked. "Send in armed teams? Lock down the entire facility?" Keshatar was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would be remembered in Kratheen history for generations to come. "No, let her finish. Let us see what we have been hunting all these centuries. Let us see what humans really are when we stop underestimating them." In the tunnels below, the child reached the 7th processor and began her final modifications. When she was done, when the last conduit was severed and the last setting was changed, the arena would be transformed into a close approximation of Paleolithic Earth. The world where humans had learned to be human, where weakness had been transmuted into strength through ingenuity and perseverance. And the hunters would learn what their ancestors had learned millions of years ago, that sometimes the prey refuses to be prey, and when that happens, everything changes. The transformation was complete. When the child emerged from the maintenance tunnels 2 hours later, she stepped into a world that no longer belonged to the Kratheen. The arena had become something older, something primal, something that resonated with patterns coded deep in human DNA. The artificial sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across terrain that had been subtly reshaped by her modifications. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to slow the Kratheen's metabolism, but comfortable for a human who had learned to regulate body temperature through movement and shelter building. The fog was thick now, rolling across the ground in waves, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 meters, and the oxygen level had stabilized at 16%, low enough to cause fatigue in Kratheen respiratory systems, but well within the range that humans had thrived in for millions of years at high altitudes. She had turned the arena into Earth's Pleistocene epoch, the crucible in which her species had been forged. This was the environment where humans had learned to hunt mammoths and saber-toothed cats, where they had transformed from prey to predator through nothing but intelligence, cooperation, and the stubborn refusal to accept their place in the food chain. The child moved through the fog with confidence, her feet finding purchase on ground she had memorized during her earlier explorations. She knew this terrain now better than the Kratheen did. Every stone, every depression, every useful feature had been catalogued and incorporated into her mental map. This was her territory now. She could hear the remaining hunters moving through the arena, their sounds carrying clearly through the still air. They were being cautious, communicating in short clicks and hisses, trying to coordinate despite the communication interference. 2 of them, she calculated, Shekmar and Kreshetal. Renders the fleeing was still unconscious in the maintenance chamber, and emergency medical teams had been dispatched to extract him. The child felt a moment of satisfaction at that. She had beaten their best hunter using nothing but environmental manipulation and an understanding of respiratory physiology. It was a victory her mother would have been proud of, a demonstration that humanity's greatest weapon had always been its mind. But the hunt wasn't over yet. 2 hunters remained, and they were learning. They wouldn't make the same mistakes. They would adapt just as she had adapted. That was the nature of any contest between intelligent species, continuous evolution of strategy and counter-strategy until one side found an advantage the other couldn't overcome. She needed to find that advantage before they did. The child made her way to the savanna section, where the tall grass provided cover and the scattered acacia trees offered potential escape routes. She moved in a crouch, presenting minimal silhouette, breathing slowly to conserve energy and reduce her thermal signature. These were skills her ancestors had perfected over millions of years, so deeply ingrained that they felt more natural than the upright walking posture that defined modern humanity. In the fog ahead, she heard movement. Deliberate, controlled. One of the hunters sweeping the area in a search pattern. The child went perfectly still, becoming a statue, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. This was another ancient skill, the ability to simply cease being noticeable, to become part of the landscape through sheer immobility. The hunter passed within 10 meters of her position, its thermal scanner sweeping back and forth. But the combination of low body temperature, fog interference, and the residual heat from the ground created enough thermal noise that the child's signature was lost in the background. The scanner couldn't distinguish her from a rock or a termite mound or any other feature of the landscape. The hunter moved on, and the child allowed herself a slow breath. Then she began to follow it. This was the reversal she had been working toward, the moment when the hunted became the hunter. She had no illusions about killing the Kratheen. Even if she could, she wouldn't. The moral calculus her mother had taught her was clear. You defended yourself, you created deterrence, but you didn't kill unless absolutely necessary. Every death created ripples, consequences that could cascade in unpredictable ways. But she could teach them. She could demonstrate that humans weren't helpless victims, that underestimating her species was a mistake that carried costs. She could change the equation of human-Kratheen relations through one perfect demonstration of capability. The hunter ahead of her was Shekmar, moving with the fluid grace of a born predator, her scales adapted to blend with the foggy environment. She was good at this, the child recognized, probably centuries of experience, but centuries meant nothing against millions of years. Time was the ultimate teacher, and humanity had sat in its classroom far longer than the Kratheen had existed as a species. The child picked up a stone, tested its weight, then threw it into the fog 30 meters to her left. It landed with a soft thump, and immediately Shekmar's head swiveled toward the sound. The hunter moved in that direction, cautious but confident, expecting to flush out prey. The child moved in the opposite direction, creating distance, setting up her next position. This was the pattern that would repeat. Sound, movement, misdirection. She would lead Shekmar in circles, exhaust her, create doubt and confusion, until the hunter's confidence eroded and was replaced by the very fear she had expected to see in her prey. On the observation platforms, the Kratheen elite watched in stunned silence. What had begun as entertainment had transformed into something else entirely, a masterclass in predator-prey reversal, a demonstration of skills and strategies they had never imagined could exist. Lord Keshetar was no longer watching as a spectator. He was studying, analyzing, committing every detail to memory. This was historical. This was the moment when the Kratheen's understanding of humanity would fundamentally change. After today, humans could never be dismissed as simple prey again. "She's hunting Shekmar," Shekril observed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "The child is actively hunting a Kratheen warrior with 3 centuries of experience." "Yes," Keshetar said simply, "and unless I'm mistaken, she's winning." In the arena, Shekmar was beginning to realize the same thing. Every sound she investigated turned out to be nothing. Every thermal signature was a false positive. Every certainty became doubt. The child was invisible, intangible, a ghost in the fog that could be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It was maddening. It was terrifying. It was exactly how prey was supposed to feel when being hunted, but Shekmar had never been prey before. She was discovering that the experience was fundamentally different from what she had imagined. Fear wasn't just an emotion. It was a cognitive poison that degraded decision-making, slowed reactions, created a downward spiral of increasingly poor choices. She needed to regroup with Kreshtal, coordinate their efforts, combine their strengths. But where was he? They had split up to cover more ground, but now in the fog, with communications disrupted, she had no way to locate him. She was alone in hostile terrain, with a threat she couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't counter. This was what it felt like to be hunted. The child appeared suddenly, 10 meters ahead, visible just long enough for Shekmar to register her presence, before disappearing back into the fog. The hunter lunged forward, her powerful legs propelling her across the ground at incredible speed, closing the distance in seconds. But when she reached the spot where the child had been, there was nothing, just an empty space and the fading echo of movement. A trap, obviously a trap. But what kind? Shekmar scanned the ground carefully, looking for concealed pits or tripwires or any of the dozens of primitive snares the child had demonstrated earlier. Nothing, just grass and dirt, and the realization hit her too late. This wasn't a trap for her body, it was a trap for her mind. The child was teaching her to be paranoid, to second-guess every step, to waste energy and focus on threats that didn't exist. It was a form of warfare that required no weapons, no physical contact, just patience and understanding of psychology. Shekmar felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly, something deeper, respect. The child was fighting with tools that transcended technology and physical power. She was fighting with millions of years of accumulated wisdom about what it meant to survive when everything wanted to kill you. "I yield," Shekmar said aloud, her voice carrying through the fog. "Human child, I acknowledge your skill. I acknowledge that I have been bested. I yield." The fog was silent for a long moment. Then the child's voice emerged from somewhere to the left, disembodied and calm. "Why would I accept your yield? Your people don't accept yields from their prey. They hunt until the prey is dead." "Because you are not like us," Shekmar said, and meant it. "You could have killed Renders the Fleeing in the maintenance chamber. You could kill me now I'm disoriented, exhausted in terrain that favors you, but you haven't. That mercy, that's not weakness. That's something we Kratheen have forgotten how to value." The child emerged from the fog, and Shekmar saw her clearly for the first time since the hunt had begun. She was small, filthy, scratched and bruised from hours of crawling through maintenance tunnels and navigating hostile terrain. But her eyes held something that made Shekmar's scales ripple with involuntary acknowledgement. Those were not the eyes of prey. Those were the eyes of something that had survived everything the universe could throw at it and had emerged not just alive, but stronger. "I don't want to kill you," the child said. "I want you to learn. I want all of you to learn. Humans aren't prey anymore. We stopped being prey 3.2 million years ago when we figured out how to make tools. We're not going to be prey again just because you're bigger and stronger. Size and strength aren't everything. They've never been everything." "What are you then?" Shekmar asked. "If not prey, what?" The child considered the question. "We're survivors. We're adapters. We're the species that refuses to accept what the universe tells us we should be. When the universe said we were too weak to hunt, we invented weapons. When it said we were too slow, we invented persistence hunting. When it said we couldn't survive in hostile environments, we invented clothing and shelter and fire. We've been arguing with reality for 3.2 million years, and we've won every single argument." Shekmar lowered her head in a gesture of submission. "I understand now why the hunting lodges have never succeeded in making humans extinct. You can't kill something that refuses to die." "We can die," the child corrected. "We die all the time. We're fragile and weak and prone to making mistakes. But we learn from those mistakes, we remember them, we teach them to our children, and every generation of humans is built on top of all the generations that came before, standing on their shoulders, reaching higher. That's our real strength, not our bodies, our continuity." A sound from the fog interrupted them, Kreshtal approaching, drawn by their voices. The male hunter emerged into the clearing and stopped, taking in the scene. His colleague in a posture of submission. The human child standing upright, confident, victorious without violence. "It's over, isn't it?" Kreshtal said quietly. "Yes," the child confirmed. "You can continue the hunt if you want, but I'll keep evading you, keep using the environment against you, keep teaching you that humans aren't prey. Or you can accept that things have changed, that your assumptions about my species were wrong, and we can all walk out of here alive." Kreshtal looked at Shekmar, who gave a small gesture of affirmation. Then he looked back at the child and slowly, deliberately, set down his hunting weapons. It was a gesture without precedent in Kratheen culture, a hunter disarming before living prey. "How do we proceed?" he asked. "You call off the hunt," the child said. "You tell your people that humans are no longer to be considered prey species. You establish protocols for interaction that assume we're equals, not victims. And you release me to whatever colony will take in an orphan. That will require approval from the highest levels of Kratheen authority," Kreshtal warned. "Then get that approval," the child said simply. "Because if you don't, I'll just have to teach this lesson again, and eventually other humans will learn what I've learned, and they'll teach their children, and their children's children. You can make this easy by changing now, or you can make it hard by waiting until humanity has created a generation of people who know how to fight back. Your choice." On the observation platform, Lord Keshatar stood and addressed the assembled elite. His voice was amplified across the entire arena, ensuring that everyone, human, Kratheen, and the few other species present, could hear him clearly. "The hunt is concluded," he announced. "Not by death, as is traditional, but by demonstration of superiority through non-lethal means. The human child has proven that her species possesses capabilities we have systematically underestimated. Effective immediately, I propose a full review of human-Kratheen relations and a re-evaluation of humanity's status in our hunting protocols." There was silence from the other platforms. Then, one by one, the elite began to signal their agreement. Not because they were kind or merciful, but because they were intelligent predators who had just learned that one of their prey species wasn't prey at all. And intelligent predators didn't waste resources fighting battles they couldn't win. The child felt something unclench in her chest, a tension she had been carrying since her family's death, since her capture, since the moment she realized she would have to fight or die. She had fought, and somehow, impossibly, she had won. Not through strength, not through speed, but through being exactly what 3.2 million years of evolution had designed her to be. A survivor who could turn any environment into home ground, who could adapt to anything, who could look at impossible odds and find a way through them anyway. "What's your name, child?" Keshatar's voice asked over the arena's speaker system. The child looked up at the observation platform and spoke loudly enough for her voice to carry. "My mother called me Sarah, but she also taught me our old family name, the one that goes back to Earth, to the beginning. She said it meant defender of humanity. She said I should only use it if I ever did something that earned it." "And what is that name?" Keshatar asked. "Alexandra," the child said. "Sarah Alexandra. And today, I defended my species. Today, I earned my name." The arena was silent, except for the sound of wind through grass and the drip of condensation from fog. Then from the observation platforms came something unprecedented in Kratheen history. They began clicking their mandibles in the pattern that signified respect for a worthy opponent. They were honoring her, not as prey, not as a victim, but as a fellow predator who had bested them in a contest of skill and will. Alexandra stood in the fog of the transformed arena and felt something she hadn't felt since her family died. Hope. Because if one child could change the Kratheen's understanding of humanity, then maybe humanity still had a future. Maybe they weren't doomed to extinction. Maybe they could claw their way back from the edge, one impossible victory at a time. 3.2 million years of evolution hadn't prepared humans to be prey. It had prepared them for exactly this, to face extinction and refuse it, to stare into the abyss and build a bridge across it, to take their weakness and transmute it into strength through nothing but stubborn, relentless, beautiful human ingenuity. The child had won, but more than that she had taught, and teaching, as every human knew, was the victory that kept on giving. The Grand Council chamber of the Kratheen Hunting Confederacy had stood for 8 centuries, its walls carved from a single massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and transformed into the seat of power for 17 star systems. The chamber was designed to intimidate, vast enough to hold 5,000 Kratheen, with ceilings that soared 100 meters overhead and walls decorated with the preserved remains of the most impressive prey ever taken in the hunts. Alexandra stood in the center of the chamber's floor, a tiny human child surrounded by thousands of predators, and felt no fear at all. She had been given 3 days to recover from the arena, 3 days of medical attention and adequate food, and something resembling rest. They had even provided her with proper clothing, a simple grey tunic and leggings that fit reasonably well, though they had clearly been designed for a young Kratheen and required adjustments to accommodate human proportions. Lord Keshatar stood beside her, his ancient scales gleaming under the chamber's harsh lighting. He had appointed himself her advocate, a role that had surprised many in the Confederacy, but made perfect sense to anyone who had watched the arena recordings. He had seen what she was capable of, he understood what she represented, and he was wise enough to know that fighting humanity would be a waste of resources that the Kratheen couldn't afford. "The Council will hear testimony regarding the status of humanity as a prey species," the Chief Arbiter announced, her voice amplified across the chamber. She was old, even by Kratheen standards, her scales nearly white with age, her body supported by mechanical augmentation that allowed her to stand upright despite centuries of accumulated injuries. "Lord Keshatar, you have brought this matter before us. State your case." Keshatar stepped forward, his movements deliberate and commanding despite his age. "Honored Council, I propose that we reclassify humanity from prey status to protected status, with full recognition as sentient equals under Confederacy law. Furthermore, I propose that we establish formal diplomatic relations with surviving human colonies and offer reparations for the harm we have inflicted over the past 300,000 years. The chamber erupted in clicks, hisses, and the grinding sound that Kratheen made when agitated. Several council members rose to their feet, their scales rippling with colors that indicated shock, anger, and disbelief. "This is madness," one of them declared, a younger male named Torshak, whose scales bore the crimson markings of the elite hunting clans. "Humans are prey. They have always been prey. One child's clever performance in an arena doesn't change millions of years of natural order. Natural order is a convenient fiction we tell ourselves to justify our behaviors," Keshatar replied calmly. "The universe has no inherent order. There is only survival and extinction, adaptation and stagnation. Humanity has demonstrated survival capabilities that exceed our models and predictions. Continuing to treat them as prey is strategically unsound." "They are weak," another council member insisted, a female named Shekrila, ancient and scarred from countless hunts. "Their bodies are fragile. They lack natural weapons. They cannot compete with us in any physical metric that matters." "May I speak?" Alexandra's voice was small in the vast chamber, but it carried clearly thanks to the acoustic engineering that ensured every word spoken on the floor could be heard throughout the space. The Chief Arbiter studied her for a long moment, then gestured assent. "The human child may address the Council." Alexandra took a breath, organizing her thoughts. Her mother had taught her about rhetoric, about how to construct arguments that could change minds. It was an ancient human skill, refined over tens of thousands of years of tribal councils and political negotiations. Words were tools, her mother had said, and like all tools, they could build or destroy depending on how you used them. "Honored counsel," she began, pitching her voice to project confidence without arrogance. "You're right that humans are physically weak. We're slower than you, weaker than you, less armored than you. By every physical metric, we should have gone extinct millions of years ago on our homeworld, but we didn't. And the reason we didn't is the same reason you should stop hunting us." "And what reason is that?" Torshak demanded. "Because we're better at surviving than we are at anything else," Alexandra said. "Humans spent millions of years being prey to everything with claws and teeth. We were eaten by cats, by bears, by birds, by crocodiles, by creatures you don't have names for. We were prey to things that make Kratheen hunters look gentle. And every time something tried to wipe us out, we adapted. We learned. We survived." She paused, letting her words settle. "You've been hunting humans for 300,000 years. You've killed millions of us. You've destroyed colonies, broken families, created generations of trauma. But we're still here. Fewer than we were, certainly. Scattered and broken, absolutely. But still here. Still adapting. Still learning." "Your point, child?" the chief arbiter asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than dismissal. "My point is that you can't make us extinct," Alexandra said flatly. "You can kill 99% of humanity, and the 1% that survives will rebuild. You can destroy our worlds and we'll survive in the debris. You can hunt us across the galaxy and we'll learn to hunt you back. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. Survival isn't a skill for us. It's our entire civilization's foundation." "Brave words from someone who has no power to enforce them," Shekrila observed. "I don't need power to enforce them," Alexandra replied. "Time will enforce them. Every day you continue hunting humans, more of us learn to fight back. More of us remember what I did in your arena. More of us understand that being prey isn't our destiny. It's just a temporary condition we're working to change. You can help that change happen peacefully, or you can resist it violently. But it's going to happen either way." Torshak rose to his full height, his scales flushing with aggressive coloration. "You dare threaten the Confederacy? You, a single orphaned child." "I'm not threatening you," Alexandra said calmly. "I'm offering you a choice. The same choice every predator species faces when its prey evolves beyond being prey. You can adapt to the new reality, or you can keep hunting and eventually discover that the prey has become more dangerous than the predator." "How?" Torshak demanded. "How could humans possibly threaten us? You have no fleet, no armies, no weapons that could challenge our military superiority." Alexandra met his gaze without flinching. "Because we don't need to beat you in a fair fight. We just need to make hunting us more expensive than it's worth. And we're very, very good at that." She gestured to the walls, where the preserved remains of famous prey animals were displayed. Every creature on these walls probably thought it was safe, because it was bigger or stronger or more dangerous than its hunters. But they all ended up here anyway because being big and strong isn't enough. You need to be adaptable. You need to be able to change when circumstances change. And right now, circumstances are changing. Lord Keshatar stepped forward, supporting her argument. "The child speaks truth. Our hunting expeditions have become increasingly costly over the past millennia. Humans have learned to hide more effectively, to create early warning systems, to evacuate before we arrive. Our success rate has declined from 97% 300 years ago to barely 60% today. At current trends, hunting humans will become economically untenable within 2 generations. Then we intensify our efforts," Torshak said. "We commit more resources. We finish what we started 300,000 years ago." "To what end?" Keshatar asked. "Pride, tradition, those are expensive luxuries in a galaxy where resources are finite and other species are expanding their territories. Every ship we send to hunt humans is a ship we can't use for defense or exploration or trade. Every warrior we lose in the hunts is a warrior we can't deploy elsewhere. The child has shown us that continuing this policy is not just morally questionable, it's strategically idiotic." The chamber fell silent. Kratheen respected strength, but they also respected pragmatic analysis of cost versus benefit. Keshatar had framed the question in terms they couldn't easily dismiss. The chief arbiter studied Alexandra with eyes that had witnessed centuries of council proceedings. "Human child, you say your species can make hunting you more expensive than it's worth. Demonstrate this claim, show us what you mean." Alexandra nodded. She had been preparing for this question since her capture, had been building the argument in her mind throughout the arena ordeal. Right now, most humans who encounter Kratheen hunters either run or die. That's because most humans don't know how to fight back effectively. They don't have the training, the knowledge, the skills that I learned from my mother. But that can change. She began walking slowly around the chamber floor, making sure her voice reached every corner. I can teach what I know to other humans. I can share the techniques my mother taught me, the trap construction, the environmental manipulation, the psychological warfare. I can turn one child's victory into a template that thousands of humans can study and improve upon. And every time a Kratheen hunting party encounters humans who fight back effectively, you lose time, resources, and warriors. We would adapt, Shekrila pointed out. Yes, Alexandra agreed, and then we would adapt to your adaptations. That's what humans do. We iterate. We learn from failures and refine our approaches. Every encounter becomes a lesson. Every loss becomes data. And because we share information across our entire species, every human benefits from every other human's experiences. That's collective learning. That's cultural evolution. And it's faster than biological evolution by orders of magnitude. She stopped at the center of the floor again. So here's what will happen if you continue hunting us. First, the easy hunts will end. Humans will become paranoid, well-trained, and ready to fight. Your success rate will drop further. Second, the cost per successful hunt will increase dramatically. You'll need more resources, better equipment, more experienced hunters. Third, you'll start losing hunters. Not many at first, but enough to make the prestigious clans think twice about human hunts. And fourth, eventually, humans will stop being prey entirely and become something else. Maybe enemies, maybe allies, but definitely not prey. Or, she continued, her voice softening, you can choose differently. You can recognize that the era of hunting humans is over, not because we've become stronger, but because we've become too expensive to hunt. You can establish diplomatic relations, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts. You can turn a costly enemy into a valuable partner, because humans have skills you need, even if you don't realize it yet. What skills could we possibly need from humans? Torshak asked skeptically. Alexandra smiled. Survival skills, adaptation skills, problem-solving skills. Humans are the best in the galaxy at figuring out how to survive in hostile environments with limited resources. That's valuable. That's worth more than the entertainment value of a hunt. And if you're willing to stop killing us long enough to work with us, you might discover that we have a lot to teach you about resilience and persistence. The chief arbiter was silent for a long moment, her ancient eyes moving from Alexandra to Keshatar to the assembled council members. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of authority. This council will deliberate on the proposals presented. The human child will be held in comfortable accommodations pending our decision. Lord Keshatar, you will compile a comprehensive analysis of human-Kratheen interactions over the past 300,000 years, with particular focus on economic costs and strategic implications. We will reconvene in 7 days to render judgment. Alexandra felt Keshatar's hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch from a creature that could crush her skull with casual pressure. You did well, he said quietly. You gave them reasons to change that appeal to their self-interest, rather than their morality. That was wise. My mother taught me that you can't change people's hearts quickly, Alexandra replied, but you can change their calculations. Make the right choice, the profitable choice, and they'll make it even if they don't particularly want to. As guards escorted her from the chamber, Alexandra caught glimpses of the council members breaking into smaller groups, already beginning their debates. Some looked angry, others thoughtful. A few seemed almost relieved, as if she had given them permission to acknowledge something they had privately believed but couldn't publicly state. She had planted seeds. Now she had to wait and see if they would grow. In her assigned quarters, far more comfortable than the holding cells she had expected, Alexandra lay on a sleeping platform designed for Kratheen, but adaptable enough for human use. She stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother, about her family, about all the humans who had died in the hunts over the centuries. She couldn't bring them back. She couldn't undo the harm that had been done. But maybe, just maybe, she could ensure that future humans wouldn't have to live in constant fear of being hunted. Maybe she could turn her personal tragedy into collective salvation. 3.2 million years of evolution had prepared her for this moment. Her ancestors had survived predators, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, famines, and countless other threats. They had survived by being stubborn, by refusing to accept extinction, by finding ways to thrive even when everything suggested they should give up and die. She was carrying their legacy forward. She was proving that humanity's greatest era wasn't behind them. It was still ahead, waiting to be built by survivors who refused to be prey anymore. Outside her window, the stars turned slowly in their infinite dance. Somewhere out there were other humans, scattered across forgotten colonies, struggling to survive in a galaxy that had tried to erase them. Soon, if everything went according to plan, they would learn that they weren't alone anymore. They would learn that one child had stood before the predators and demanded equality instead of begging for mercy. They would learn that humanity was still fighting, still adapting, still surviving, and most importantly, still refusing to accept what the universe said they should be. The child closed her eyes and slept the deep sleep of someone who had fought hard and fought well. Tomorrow she would wake and continue the battle, because that was what humans did. They survived today so they could fight again tomorrow, forever if necessary. The 7 days passed slowly. Alexandra spent them in a strange limbo between prisoner and guest. Her quarters were comfortable, the food was adequate if unfamiliar, and she was granted limited access to Confederacy databases, a privilege that surprised her until she realized it was a test. They were watching to see what she would research, what she would prioritize, how she would use information when given access to it. She used it to study. She pulled up everything available about human colony locations, population estimates, cultural practices, and survival strategies. She memorized star charts showing where human settlements had been and might still be. She read histories of human Kratheen encounters, learning which tactics had worked and which had failed. She studied Kratheen psychology, biology, and social structures, looking for leverage points and potential allies. Her mother had taught her that information was the ultimate survival tool. Strength faded, technology broke, but knowledge could be preserved and passed on indefinitely. So Alexandra gathered knowledge like her ancestors had gathered seeds during harvest season, storing it away for future use. On the 5th day, Lord Keshatar visited her quarters. He carried with him a data tablet, its screen displaying complex analyses and projections. His scales were darker than usual, suggesting stress or deep thought. "The council is divided," he said without preamble, settling his considerable bulk onto a reinforced chair designed for Kratheen visitors. "Roughly 40% support my proposal for reclassification and reparations. 30% are adamantly opposed, viewing it as surrender to prey. The remaining 30% are undecided, waiting to see which way the political winds blow." Alexandra nodded, having expected something like this. What would push the undecided group to support the proposal? "Evidence," Keshatar said. "They need to see concrete proof that continuing the hunts is more costly than ending them. They need economic data, strategic analysis, projections of long-term consequences, the kind of information that appeals to pragmatism rather than emotion. Do you have that data?" "I have preliminary analyses," Keshatar admitted, "but the undecided council members are skeptical of data that comes from someone who has already declared his position. They want independent verification, or better yet, a demonstration that cannot be dismissed as theoretical." Alexandra was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "What if we could show them what would happen if humanity organized to fight back? Not just one child in an arena, but coordinated resistance across multiple colonies." Keshatar's eyes narrowed with interest. "You believe such organization is possible?" "I think it's inevitable," Alexandra said. "Humans are scattered now, isolated, disconnected, but information spreads, stories spread. When other humans learn what happened in your arena, they'll start asking questions. They'll start experimenting with the techniques I used. They'll start teaching their children. And eventually someone will figure out how to coordinate those efforts across colonies. That could take decades," Keshatar pointed out, "or it could take weeks, if someone gave them a template to follow," Alexandra countered. She stood and began pacing, her mind working through possibilities. "What if we created a message, a comprehensive guide to fighting back against Kratheen hunts, based on everything I learned from my mother and everything I demonstrated in the arena? We broadcast it to every human colony we can reach, and then we sit back and watch what happens." "That would be incredibly dangerous," Keshatar said slowly. "If humans across the galaxy suddenly began employing effective resistance tactics, the hunting clans would demand escalation. We could end up with a full-scale war." "Maybe," Alexandra acknowledged. Or maybe the hunting clans would look at the costs of that war and decide it's not worth fighting. Either way, the undecided council members would have their evidence. They would see, in real time, what organized human resistance looks like, and they could make their decision based on actual data rather than projections. Keshatar was silent for a long time, his claws clicking against the data tablet in a rhythm that suggested deep thought. "This is a significant risk," he said finally. "If it backfires, if humans use your teachings to launch attacks rather than defensive actions, it could harden Confederacy attitudes for generations." "Then we make sure the message emphasizes defense over offense," Alexandra said. "We frame it as survival skills, not military tactics. We teach humans how to escape, how to hide, how to make themselves too expensive to hunt, not how to attack Kratheen settlements or ships. Can you create such a message?" Alexandra met his gaze. "I can try, but I'll need help. I'll need someone who understands Kratheen hunting patterns and can explain how to counter them. I'll need access to communication equipment capable of reaching multiple star systems. And I'll need protection if this goes wrong, and the hunting clans decide I'm too dangerous to keep alive. I can provide all of that," Keshatar said. "But understand, if we do this, there is no going back. You will have declared yourself humanity's representative, whether you intended to or not. Every human success or failure will be attributed to you. Every consequence will be your responsibility." "I know," Alexandra said quietly. "I've known since I decided to fight in the arena instead of dying quietly. I'm already responsible for whatever comes next. This just makes it official." Keshatar studied her for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeing something that made his scales ripple with colors Alexandra couldn't interpret. "You are very young to carry such a burden. Humans mature faster when circumstances require it," Alexandra replied. "We don't have the luxury of long childhoods when survival is uncertain. My mother started teaching me these skills when I was 6 years old. She knew I might need them someday. She was right." "Very well," Keshatar said, rising to his feet. "We will create your message, but we must be careful about timing. We will wait until after the council reconvenes, after they have heard my economic analysis and strategic projections. Then, if they remain deadlocked, we will propose your message as a way to gather empirical data. That way it becomes part of the official decision-making process, rather than an independent action that could be viewed as treason." "Agreed," Alexandra said. "When do we start?" "Now," Keshatar said. "I want the message prepared and ready before the council reconvenes. That gives us 2 days." They worked without stopping, Alexandra dictating while Keshatar recorded and organized the information into a format that could be transmitted across interstellar distances. They included everything: trap construction techniques, environmental manipulation strategies, psychological warfare tactics, guidance on using Kratheen hunting patterns against them, but most importantly, they included context. Alexandra spoke directly to the camera, her young face serious and her voice clear, explaining not just how to fight back, but why it was necessary and what it could accomplish. "My name is Sarah Alexandra," she said into the recording. 3 weeks ago I was captured by Kratheen hunters and brought to their arena. I was supposed to die there like millions of humans have died over the past 300,000 years. But I didn't die. I fought back using skills my mother taught me, skills that came from millions of years of human ancestors who survived when everything said they should die. She paused, letting her words carry the weight of history. "I'm not special. I'm not particularly strong or fast or brave. I'm just a human who refused to be prey anymore. And if I can do it, you can do it. Your children can do it, your grandchildren can do it, because these skills aren't about individual talent. They're about collective knowledge that has been refined over millions of years." The recording continued for hours, covering every technique in exhaustive detail. Alexandra demonstrated trap construction using materials that would be available in most environments. She explained how to read terrain for advantages and how to create disadvantages for pursuers. She taught breathing exercises that could lower thermal signatures and movement patterns that minimized visibility. But perhaps most importantly, she talked about psychology, both human and Kratheen. "Fear is a tool," she said. "The Kratheen use it against us, making us panic and make poor decisions. But fear works both ways. Predators fear uncertainty. They fear prey that doesn't behave as expected. They fear environments they can't control. Use that, make them uncertain, make them doubt their assumptions, Make them waste time and resources chasing ghosts while you slip away to safety. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes holding an intensity that made her seem far older than her 12 years. We can't outfight the Kratheen, but we don't need to. We just need to make hunting us more trouble than it's worth. We need to be the problem that never goes away, the expense that keeps growing, the prey that costs more to catch than it's worth eating. This isn't about revenge, she continued. This isn't about making the Kratheen pay for what they've done. This is about survival. This is about ensuring that future generations of humans don't have to live in fear. This is about changing the equation so that peace becomes more profitable than war. When the recording was finally complete, Keshatar reviewed it carefully, checking for anything that might be misinterpreted or used to justify human aggression. He made a few edits, softening certain phrases and adding context where necessary. Then he encrypted it and prepared it for potential transmission. "This is good work," he said. "If humans follow these teachings, they will become significantly harder to hunt, perhaps impossible to hunt economically. The question is whether that will lead to peace or escalation. That depends on the Council's decision," Alexandra said. "If they choose to recognize us as equals and establish diplomatic relations, we can avoid escalation. If they choose to double down on hunting, then humans will have no choice but to make themselves too expensive to hunt. Either way, the current situation changes." On the 7th day, Alexandra returned to the Grand Council chamber. The space was even more crowded than before, with additional observers packing the upper galleries. Word had spread throughout the Confederacy about the human child who had defeated their best hunters, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The chief arbiter called the session to order with a single sharp click of her mandibles. "This council has reviewed Lord Keshatar's analysis of human-Kratheen relations over the past 300,000 years. We have examined economic data, strategic projections, and historical patterns. We have debated extensively among ourselves and with our constituents. It is time to render judgment." She paused, and the chamber fell silent. "The Council has determined that humanity's status requires modification. However, we are not unanimous in our view of what that modification should be. Therefore, we will present 3 proposals and allow for democratic consideration." 3 holographic displays materialized above the chamber floor, each showing a different policy option. Proposal 1. Maintain current status with increased efficiency protocols. Proposal 2. Reclassify humans as protected sentience with limited diplomatic recognition. Proposal 3. Full reclassification as equals with comprehensive reparations and alliance negotiations. Each council member will vote according to their conscience and the interests of their constituency, the chief arbiter continued. But before we vote, we will hear final statements from key stakeholders. Lord Keshatar? Keshatar stepped forward, his presentation combining data visualization with historical analysis. He made the economic case clearly and comprehensively. Hunting humans was becoming unprofitable, would likely become impossible within 2 generations, and represented a poor allocation of Confederacy resources. Better to establish diplomatic relations now while goodwill was still possible than to wait until forced to by economic reality. When he finished, Torshak rose to present the counter-argument. His case focused on tradition, honor, and the symbolic importance of maintaining hunting rights. To reclassify humans would be to admit error, to show weakness, to suggest that prey could dictate terms to predators. The debate continued for hours, with various council members adding their perspectives. Alexandra listened carefully, noting which arguments seemed to sway the undecided members and which fell flat. Finally, the chief arbiter turned to her. "Human child, you have heard our deliberations. Do you have any final statement before we vote?" Alexandra stood, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon her. This was the moment. This was where everything would be decided, not just her fate, but potentially the fate of her entire species. "Honored Council," she began, "I want to tell you a story about a species that almost went extinct 200,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence suggests that the human population dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals during a climate catastrophe on Earth. By any reasonable measure, we should have died out. But we didn't." She paused. "Do you know why? Because those 10,000 humans had learned something that no other species on Earth had fully mastered. They had learned to cooperate across genetic kinship lines. They had learned to share knowledge across groups. They had learned to sacrifice individual advantage for collective survival, and that made all the difference. We survived that bottleneck and every crisis since because we're not just individuals. We're a collective memory, a distributed intelligence, a species that treats knowledge as our most precious resource. Everything we learn, we teach. Everything we experience, we share. Every generation stands on the shoulders of all previous generations. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many council members as she could. You're debating whether to recognize us as equals. But the truth is, we don't need your recognition to be equal. We already are equal, just in different ways. You're stronger. We're more adaptable. You're faster. We're more persistent. You have better individual warriors. We have better collective learning. These are different strengths, not lesser ones. The question you're really debating is whether you want us as partners or enemies, because those are the only two options. The era of humans as prey is over. I've proven that. The only question is what comes next. Choose partnership, and we can combine your strengths with ours. Choose enmity, and we'll prove that 3.2 million years of evolution has taught us how to be very expensive enemies. Choose wisely, she finished quietly, because this choice will echo through centuries. Your descendants will judge you based on what you decide today. The chamber was silent when she sat down. Then the chief arbiter nodded slowly and said, "The council will now vote." The results appeared on the holographic displays as each member registered their choice. Proposal 1, 23%. Proposal 2, 41%. Proposal 3, 36%. Proposal 2 had won. Limited recognition as protected. Sentience with potential for future diplomatic relations. Not everything Alexandra had hoped for, but not nothing either. It was progress. It was a beginning. The chief arbiter made it official. By majority vote, humanity is hereby reclassified from prey status to protected sentient status. Hunting of humans is prohibited effective immediately. Diplomatic channels will be opened with surviving human colonies. A reparations committee will be established to determine appropriate compensation for past harms, and Lord Keshatar will serve as humanity's official liaison to the Confederacy until such time as humans can appoint their own representative. She looked at Alexandra. You are free to return to human space with full safe passage guarantees. Additionally, you are invited to serve as humanity's voice in preliminary diplomatic negotiations, should you choose to accept this responsibility. Alexandra felt something unlock in her chest. She had done it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. She had changed the equation. She had bought humanity time and recognition and a chance to rebuild. "I accept," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "And I have one request." "Speak," the chief arbiter said. "I want to send a message to all human colonies. A message explaining what happened here, what we accomplished, and what comes next. With your permission, I want to teach other humans that we don't have to be prey anymore, that we can fight back, that we can demand respect, that we can survive and thrive even in a galaxy that tried to erase us." The chief arbiter considered this. Then she nodded. "Granted, you may send your message. It will be transmitted via Confederacy communication networks to ensure maximum reach." Alexandra smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since her family had died. The message was ready. The teaching was prepared, and humanity was about to learn that one child had stood before the predators, and won not through strength, but through the accumulated wisdom of 3.2 million years of refusing to accept extinction. The hunted had become the teacher. And the lesson was just beginning. 5 years later, the human settlement on Kepler 452b had grown from a struggling colony of 2,000 survivors to a thriving community of nearly 10,000. The settlement sprawled across a valley that reminded the older residents of Earth's Mediterranean regions, rolling hills covered in native grasses that swayed in the constant breeze, a river that ran clear and cold from the mountains, and a sky that shifted from deep purple at dawn to brilliant amber at sunset. At the center of the settlement stood a structure that hadn't existed 5 years ago, the Academy. It was built in a style that blended human and Kratheen architectural principles, a deliberate symbol of the new relationship between species. The walls were stone quarried from local mountains, but the design incorporated the high ceilings and acoustic engineering that the Kratheen favored. Inside, young humans learned the curriculum that Alexandra had developed, not just survival skills, but philosophy, diplomacy, science, and the kind of strategic thinking that had saved her in the arena. Alexandra herself stood in one of the Academy's training rooms, watching a class of 15 children practice the techniques she had documented 5 years ago. They ranged in age from 8 to 14, all of them born into a galaxy where humans were no longer prey, but were still learning what it meant to be equals. The instructor, a woman named Maria who had survived 3 Kratheen hunting encounters before Alexandra's message had reached her colony, was demonstrating how to construct a snare trap using only natural materials. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying the authority of experience, "the trap itself doesn't need to hold your pursuer. It just needs to slow them down long enough for you to create distance. Every second they spend dealing with your preparation is a second you're not being chased." Alexandra smiled. The teaching was spreading exactly as she had hoped, not as a rigid doctrine, but as a flexible framework that each teacher adapted to their own experience and environment. That was the human way. That was what had allowed them to survive for 3.2 million years. "Alexandra," a voice called from the doorway. She turned to see Lord Keshitar, who had become a regular visitor to Kepler 442b over the past 5 years. His scales had faded further with age, but his mind remained sharp. He had appointed himself humanity's unofficial mentor, teaching Alexandra about galactic politics and diplomacy, with the same thoroughness that her mother had taught her survival skills. "Lord Keshitar," she greeted him warmly, "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I brought news that couldn't wait," he said, gesturing for her to follow him outside. They walked together through the settlement's main plaza, where humans and a few Kratheen visitors moved side by side, not always comfortably, but without the fear that had defined the relationship for so long. "The Confederacy Council has made a decision," Keshitar said, as they reached a quiet overlook with a view of the valley. "They've voted to approve full diplomatic recognition for humanity, including representation on the Confederacy Senate and access to protected trade routes. The reparations package has also been finalized: substantial territory grants, technology transfers, and financial compensation that should help rebuild what was lost." Alexandra felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and a bittersweet sadness that her mother hadn't lived to see this moment. That's more than I hoped for." "You earned it," Keshitar said simply. "Over the past 5 years, humans have demonstrated exactly what you promised they would. You've made yourselves too valuable as partners to remain marginalized. Your academy has trained thousands of students, and they're spreading across the galaxy, establishing new settlements, opening trade relationships, sharing your unique problem-solving approaches. You've become essential. We're still recovering," Alexandra pointed out, "still rebuilding, still carrying the trauma of 300,000 years." "Of course," Keshitar acknowledged. "Healing takes time, but you're moving in the right direction, and more importantly, you're ensuring that future generations won't carry the same trauma. The children in that classroom will grow up knowing they're not prey. That changes everything." They were quiet for a moment, watching the sun set over the valley. Then Keshitar said, "There's something else. The Council wants to honor you formally. They're proposing to create a new title, Ambassador of Human Interests, and they want you to be the first to hold it." Alexandra turned to look at him surprised. "I'm 17 years old. You were 12 when you defeated our best hunters and changed the course of galactic history," Keshitar replied. "Age is less relevant than capability, and you've proven your capability beyond any doubt. Besides, who better to represent humanity than someone who embodies its greatest strengths: adaptability, persistence, and the refusal to accept what others say you should be." "I'll need to think about it," Alexandra said. "Being humanity's voice is a big responsibility, maybe too big for one person." "Then build a team," Keshitar suggested. "Humans excel at collective action. Create a diplomatic corps, train other representatives, distribute the responsibility. But accept the title. Humanity needs a symbol, and you've become that symbol whether you want it to or not." Alexandra knew he was right. Over the past 5 years, her message had spread to every human colony in known space. Her face had become synonymous with the human revival, with the refusal to remain victims. Children were being named after her. Settlements were adopting her techniques as foundational knowledge. She had become legend, and legends carried responsibilities that individuals couldn't avoid. "I'll accept," she said finally. "On one condition. The Confederacy has to agree to support the establishment of human autonomous zones, regions of space where humans can govern themselves according to their own customs and values. We'll maintain diplomatic relations, honor trade agreements, contribute to mutual defense, But we need space to be ourselves, without constantly adapting to other species' expectations. I can advocate for that, Keshatar said. In fact, I think the Council would view it favorably. They've learned that diversity of approach often produces better solutions than monoculture. Having humans develop independently while maintaining connections to the larger galactic community could benefit everyone. They shook on it. A human gesture that Keshatar had learned, his scaled hand carefully calibrating pressure to avoid crushing her much more fragile bones. Over the following months, the transformation of human-Kratheen relations continued. The first human autonomous zone was established in a region called the Refuge Cluster, 15 star systems that had once been considered too marginal for major powers to claim. Humans transformed those marginal systems into thriving settlements, using the adaptability and resource efficiency that had allowed their ancestors to survive Earth's ice ages. The Academy on Kepler 442b became the model for dozens of similar institutions across human space. Each adapted the core curriculum to local conditions, but all maintained the fundamental principle. Humans would never be prey again because they would never forget the lessons that 3.2 million years of evolution had taught them. Alexandra spent her days negotiating with other species, establishing trade relationships, and building the diplomatic infrastructure that humanity needed to maintain its new status. She spent her nights teaching at the Academy, ensuring that the next generation understood not just what had happened but why it mattered. One evening, she stood before a class of advanced students, teenagers who would soon leave the Academy to establish new settlements or serve in diplomatic roles, and tried to summarize everything she had learned. "You've all studied the history," she began. "You know what the Kratheen did to us for 300,000 years. You know about the hunts, the deaths, the suffering. And some of you are angry about that. You want revenge, or at least acknowledgement of harm." She paused, letting them process. "But here's what I've learned over the past 5 years. Revenge is expensive and ultimately unsatisfying. The Kratheen who hunted our ancestors are dead or dying. The ones alive today are different individuals living in a different context. We can't punish them for their ancestors' crimes without becoming the kind of species we don't want to be." One of the students, a girl named Keiko who had lost her parents in a hunt 7 years ago, raised her hand. "So we just forgive them? We pretend it never happened?" "No," Alexandra said firmly. "We never pretend. We remember. We teach the history. We make sure every human child knows what happened and why. But we use that memory as motivation to build something better, not as justification for perpetuating cycles of violence." She walked to the window, looking out at the settlement that had grown from nothing. "The Kratheen thought they were teaching us our place in the universe, prey that exists to be hunted, but they actually taught us something much more important. They taught us that we're resilient beyond measure, that we can survive anything if we're willing to adapt and learn, that weakness can be transmuted into strength through ingenuity and persistence. 3.2 million years ago, humans were prey to everything with claws and teeth. We were weak, slow, vulnerable. We should have gone extinct, but we didn't because we learned to use our biggest advantage, our minds. We learned to cooperate, to build tools, to modify our environment instead of just adapting to it. We learned to be human." She turned back to face the class. "The Kratheen hunts didn't make us strong. They revealed strength we already had, but had forgotten. They forced us to remember what our ancestors knew, that humans don't survive by being the biggest or strongest or fastest. We survive by being the most adaptable, the most persistent, the most stubbornly unwilling to accept extinction." "So what do we do with that knowledge?" she asked. "We build, we teach, we create a civilization that reflects our values, cooperation over domination, adaptation over rigidity, learning over stagnation. We prove that there are multiple ways to be successful in this galaxy, and that the predator model isn't the only one that works." Keiko raised her hand again. "What if someone tries to hunt us again? What if the Kratheen change their minds, or another species decides humans look like easy prey?" Alexandra smiled. "Then we remind them why we're still here after 3.2 million years of being hunted. We show them our traps, our strategies, our absolutely unshakable refusal to go quietly into extinction, and we make them understand that humans are the most expensive prey in the galaxy, not worth hunting, even if you think you can win." "But we also offer them an alternative," she continued. "We show them that partnering with humans produces better outcomes than fighting us. We demonstrate that our problem-solving abilities, our adaptability, Our unique perspective on challenges can benefit everyone. We give them reasons to value us as allies rather than dismiss us as prey. The class was silent, absorbing her words. Then a boy named Marcus spoke up. My father says you're the reason we're not prey anymore. He says you saved humanity. Alexandra shook her head. I didn't save humanity. Humanity saved itself, the same way it's been saving itself for millions of years. I just reminded everyone, humans and Kratheen alike, that we've never been as weak as we looked. I made visible what was always true but had been forgotten. She walked back to the front of the room. Every one of you has that same strength. You're all carrying 3.2 million years of survival instincts, problem-solving abilities, and sheer stubborn persistence. My job isn't to save you. It's to teach you to save yourselves, and then to teach your children, and your children's children, forever. Because that's what humans do. We pass on knowledge we build on previous generations. We never stop learning and adapting. The Kratheen have been predators for 300,000 years, she concluded. We've been prey for 3.2 million. We've had 10 times longer to learn our role. And what we learned is that prey doesn't have to stay prey. Evolution doesn't stop. Status isn't fixed. Everything changes. And the species that recognize that survive, while the ones that cling to static definitions go extinct. So go out there, she told them. Build your settlements, establish your trade routes, negotiate your treaties. Have your children and teach them what you've learned. And when someone asks you what humans are, tell them this. We're the species that was prey for 3.2 million years and refused to stay prey. We're the ones who looked at extinction and said, not today. We're survivors who turned survival into an art form and then shared that art with anyone willing to learn. That's what humans are. That's what we've always been. And that's what we'll continue to be for as long as the stars burn. The students filed out slowly, their faces thoughtful. Alexandra watched them go and felt a deep satisfaction. This was how change happened, not through single dramatic moments, but through teaching that rippled across generations, creating waves that transformed entire cultures. Lord Keshatar appeared in the doorway after the last student had left. That was well said. My mother would have said it better, Alexandra replied. Perhaps, Keshatar acknowledged. But she isn't here and you are. That's the nature of succession. Each generation does its best with the knowledge and circumstances it inherits, then passes on what it's learned to the next. They walked together to the overlook where they had stood 5 years ago. The settlement had grown substantially since then, spreading across the valley floor and climbing into the foothills. Lights were beginning to appear as evening fell, creating constellations that mirrored the stars above. Do you ever regret it? Keshatar asked. Choosing to fight instead of accepting death in the arena. Your life would be simpler if you had remained anonymous. Alexandra considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted, being a symbol is exhausting. People expect things from me that I can't always deliver. Children look at me like I'm some kind of hero, but I'm just someone who got lucky and stubborn at the right moment. And yet you continue, Keshatar observed. Because someone has to, Alexandra said. Because the work isn't finished. Because humanity needs people willing to stand up and say we deserve better than extinction. And because, she paused, searching for words, because my mother spent her life preserving knowledge that saved mine. I owe it to her to pass that knowledge forward. That's the human way. We receive gifts from the past and give them to the future. Keshatar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am old, Alexandra. By Kratheen standards, I should have been dead decades ago, but I've lived to see something remarkable. 2 species that were predator and prey, learning to be something else together. Partners, allies, maybe eventually friends. That's worth living for. Thank you, Alexandra said simply, for believing a human child when you had no reason to, for advocating for change when it would have been easier to maintain tradition, for teaching me how to navigate galactic politics without losing my humanity. You taught me as much as I taught you, Keshatar replied. You showed me that strength comes in forms I hadn't recognized, that prey can be more formidable than predators, because they've had to be. That 3.2 million years of evolutionary pressure creates capabilities that 300,000 years of dominance can't match. They stood together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, 2 representatives of species that had been enemies for millennia, but were learning to be something better. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still misunderstandings, still moments when old instincts threatened to override new intentions. But it was progress, and progress was enough. Alexandra thought about her mother, about her family, about all the humans who had died in the hunts over countless generations. She couldn't bring them back. She couldn't undo the harm that had been done, but she could ensure that their deaths meant something, that their suffering had purchased knowledge that would protect future generations. That was the human way. That was what 3.2 million years of evolution had taught them, not just how to survive, but how to transform tragedy into wisdom, weakness into strength, being hunted into becoming unhuntable. Somewhere in the settlement below, children were learning to build traps and read terrain and think strategically about survival. Somewhere, diplomats were negotiating agreements that would protect human interests across the galaxy. Somewhere, families were gathering for evening meals, secure in the knowledge that they weren't prey anymore. Alexandra had started something 5 years ago in a Kratheen arena. She had proven that one human with knowledge and courage could change the equation for an entire species. But more importantly, she had taught that lesson to others, and they were teaching it to still others, creating a cascade of capability that would echo through generations. The hunted had become the teachers, the prey had become the partners, and humanity, that stubborn, persistent, endlessly adaptable species, had once again refused to accept what the universe said they should be, and had instead become what they chose to be: survivors, builders, teachers, humans. After 3.2 million years of being something's dinner, they had finally proven what their ancestors had always known, that being prey was just a temporary condition, a challenge to overcome, a problem to solve through ingenuity and cooperation, and the absolutely unshakable refusal to go quietly into extinction. The stars turned overhead, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on worlds scattered across the galaxy. But on one of those worlds, in a valley on Kepler 442b, a 17-year-old girl stood with an ancient alien and smiled at the future they were building together. It wasn't the future anyone had predicted, but then humans had never been very good at following predictions. They preferred to write their own stories. And this story, the story of how prey became partners and hunters became allies, was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead. There would be setbacks and conflicts and moments when progress seemed impossible. But there would also be persistence, adaptation, learning, and the kind of stubborn human determination that had carried their species through ice ages and plagues and extinctions, and 300,000 years of being hunted. Alexandra knew one thing with absolute certainty: humanity would survive, because that's what humans did. They survived, and then they taught others how to survive too. Forever, if necessary. 3.2 million years of evolution had prepared them for exactly that, and the lesson was far from over. The end.